Thank you so much for spending your evening. And I just want to do some quick overview of, feel free at any time to get more food. The restrooms are out the door to the right. The sign-in sheets are those blue tablets, and just make sure before you leave that you've signed in and you can RSVP for the next 2 meetings on the tablet, so you don't have to do that again. Just a quick background, how many people, this is the second of 4 meetings. How many people is this their first meeting? Excellent. So each meeting is standalone. There's nothing you need to know that we covered in the last meeting. And the final meeting will be sort of a combination of the first 3. I appreciate that there is a range of experience and expertise. There's neighbors who have experienced housing in their neighborhoods. There's people who are building houses. There are people who are funding houses, and there's several planning commissioners in the room. Thank you so much for attending. Janessa is lead on the project, and what we're going to do today is do a combination of presentation as a large group, questions as a large group, and then discussion as a small group. And then we'll do that again with the second issue and the third issue. So we're kind of going to break things up, and there'll be plenty of time for questions. We're going to go ahead and do the initial PowerPoint, have Janessa and Alyssa go through it and do questions before we break into discussion. And is there anything I'm missing before? Yep, I did the bathrooms. I think that'll do it.
That's good. Okay, so thank you guys for coming. Thanks for the people who have come again, and I know there's some people who have done housing tools and strategies again in a close time frame from this. So thank you especially for being so dedicated. I wanted to talk a little bit before we get into the first topic of the night. Since this is the first meeting for some people, I just wanted to do a quick reminder of why we're here. And the big issue is that housing is a critical need in our community. We're one of the most constrained housing markets in the country, and we'll need to accommodate 15,000 new homes by 2032. So in addition to this project, as many of you know, and some of you are participating in, there's the Housing Tools and Strategies project that Council directed to explore and ways to address housing affordability, availability, and diversity of type. So that's a separate one going on right now, but somewhat related. Back to our project though, we didn't expand our urban growth boundary when we were doing the study back in 2015. And we did a housing needs assessment that determined that we could accommodate the growth on our current land inventory. And so that said, much of the easy land to be developed has already been developed. And so that leaves us with properties that are harder to develop. Council heard that it's difficult and costly and time consuming to obtain land use approval to provide the housing that our community needs. And as a compromise for not expanding the urban growth boundary, one of the things that came out of some of their 2015 work was the direction for this project to update the clear and objective path for land use applications. So our project goal, which is a big lift, is to identify land use approval criteria and procedures that need to be updated, removed, added, to mitigate barriers to housing, how to increase efficiency and predictability in our land use process, and how to effectively address development impacts. So last time, the topics we covered were fire, life, and safety, and we talked about the process for site reviews, conditional use, and planned unit developments. So the worksheets that we used at that meeting, if you haven't turned them in already, if you brought them tonight, feel free to give them to us, or you can use the online survey tool that's already up on the website and enter your information on there. I just wanted to mention too that you can weigh in at whatever level you're comfortable with. We'll get some very specific suggestions from some people, but we don't want anybody to feel like they need to be an expert. All levels of input are helpful. So to that end, when you're working through your worksheet, there's note sections. Use those note sections. Maybe you could support a topic or a particular concept only if there was something addressed. So give us those kind of commentary notes so that we know, maybe you're close to supporting it, or maybe you really, really hate it, and tell us why you really, really hate it. Like, what's the big sticking point? So anyway, that using the notes section like that will really help us get a better idea of what the biggest concerns and priorities are. So I also want to point out that there are copies of presentation slides on your tables. There's like 2 copies per table. So if during the table discussions you want to refer back to one of the slides, they're there. And I think that's all I was going to say at this point, and I'll hand it over.
How about
Oh yeah, did anybody bring their key issue summary? And if not, we do have some extra ones that we can put either at the table or I'm not sure. I think we've got close to 20 of them.
Yeah, this is a big report that surveys all the issues and is kind of the basis for what we're working with at this point. And we have several. Anybody that needs one?
Yeah, if we could at least make sure that there's a few at each table, that would be helpful for the group discussions.
It's that blue cover. I've got it.
Yeah, you got that. Okay.
Thank you,
Okay.
Julie. Okay, so now I'll hand it over to Alyssa for the first topic of the night.
Again, thank you all for being here. My name is Alyssa Hansen. I'm with the Planning Division, and I get to talk to you about transportation. I'm not an engineer. We did invite one of our engineers from our Public Works Department here today in case there's some more technical questions. His name is Scott. Scott's in the back there. Thank you for coming. Anyway, in terms of transportation, there are 3 issues we're going to be covering tonight. Definition of pedestrian, addressing traffic impacts, and addressing the modifications to the street standards. So what I'm going to do is introduce each of those, give you a little bit of background in them, kind of walk you through what we came up with for some possible concepts to seed your conversations, and then we'll pause for questions on each of those specific topics. But really, I think the most important part of this is getting to your discussions and at your tables and filling in the sheets to the extent you want to. So first topic again is about defining pedestrian. So what was pointed out is the land use code does not provide a definition for the word pedestrian that specifies the types of non-motorized users that are included when it's referenced in a clear and objective approval criteria. I am going to point out that there's really just a handful of references to pedestrian in the clear and objective approval criteria, but there's about 300 references in the entire code. So it's a word that gets used a lot, is what Microsoft Word told me. So in the context of development and review, we're looking at transportation facilities and access connections for vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrian traffic. So this is a lot of words, but this is an example of one of the clear and objective approval criteria that includes the word pedestrian, and I've highlighted pedestrian so you can kind of see how it's used, but it's really about the provision of pedestrian, bicycle, and transit circulation among buildings located within the development site, etc. And so this comes from our subdivision approval criteria. And if you really want to read more, this is on page 35 of your key summaries report right there in front of you. So in terms of possible actions or concepts, for all of these, we've put no change on every single one of them, because that is obviously an option, is to not change it, to not add a definition of pedestrian. The second one, which is located on, what color are those sheets? Gold, if you look on the first page of the gold stack of sheets, I've just summarized them on here, but, so there's the no change option or possibility. The second one would be adding a definition to specify, to be really specific about the types of non-motorized users. And we just used in that particular example, word for word, what was provided to us as a suggestion from a stakeholder. I will point out it does include the word bicycle, which I think may be problematic because bicycle is used in a whole lot of other places within the code. So, but you know, that again, that could be something that you say, hey, I like this, but take out bicycle. We've also provided a definition that was provided in state statute. So when we were talking with our colleagues in Public Works, they said, hey, look, there's a statute, a definition provided in the Oregon Revised Statutes. It's pretty simple. It's any person afoot or confined in a wheelchair. That seems to work as well. You all may have other ideas as well. So that's the first issue. Are there any questions on this particular one?
I have just
Sure.
a nitpicky one. Wheelchair users, does that also apply to motorized wheelchairs?
It starts out with non-motorized.
What do you think, Scott? Yes. But that could be a clarification that could be included in there. So, yeah, go ahead.
I just had a process question where we strongly support to strongly oppose. If we put strongly support and then in the notes I would strongly support this, but without bicycles.
Absolutely. Yes, that is.
So that would be the way that would work.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I said the first meeting, and I just really want to reinforce the structure of the input is just to help people that want structure. If it's upsetting to you to see all that stuff, just turn the paper over and write whatever you want to write. Like, it's only as an assist to you, not as something. We're not taking all of the input and voting, we're not counting, we're looking at different stakeholder groups, different views, we're talking to people, we're having meetings, and it's going to be an assemblage of all of that. So just, yeah, that's a super important thing for me as a
Good clarification. Go ahead, Ron.
There are, in some cities, there are a lot of these battery-operated scooters that are starting to be, you just park it wherever you want, somebody else comes along and gets on it and goes. And there have been reports that they are kind of a menace to pedestrians and so on. So that's another odd category of motorized stuff that's going on sidewalks, but
Whether or not it should, right. Well, I think that's a good thing to mark down in your comments. I'm not sure what I think about those. We don't see too many around here, I guess.
no, but I mean, they'll probably
Yeah.
arrive here at some
No, I
point.
know, you kind of got to think ahead to hoverboards and whatnot, so, okay. All right, thank you. There's no more questions. I'm going to move on to the second transportation issue, which I think might garner more questions, and it's about traffic impact. So the clear and objective approval criteria for subdivisions, site reviews, conditional use permits, it does not include a criteria that addresses traffic impact. So I'll just walk you through, hopefully you can read that. These are the PUD, Plan Unit Development Approval Criteria related to transportation. So there really are a lot of criteria standards that relate to transportation. And in most cases, they're in both the clear and objective track and in the discretionary standards. So they both cover street standards, they both cover public improvement standards, they both cover on-site pedestrian circulation, public access, pedestrian bike and transit circulation, and vision clearance. And then obviously the big difference here is when you get to, requiring a traffic impact analysis. And even if our clear and objective standard says you need to go do a traffic impact analysis, those existing standards are not written to be clear and objective. So it is, been identified as an issue here. Just a couple things about TIAs or traffic impact analysis in general. They're typically only triggered at this point based on our existing code for larger projects. So if you have a 100-lot subdivision, you would trigger the need to do a traffic impact analysis. For multifamily, it's about 167 multifamily units would trigger the traffic impact analysis. So you wouldn't even really get there at this point unless you had a large project. If you're doing the discretionary, then you would do that analysis, and then clear and objective, you don't have to do that kind of traffic impact at all. So just in terms of what we hear about traffic or transportation in general, I mean, I think the big issues we hear are congestion, safety, speed, parking, bicycle, pedestrian, and transit access and safety, and you may have others to add to that list. As a parent of a child who just recently got their license, I worry about your safety on the road, so I don't know where to put that in here, but my apologies. So what we have come up with, and I'm hoping you can help us out with this one, is, so first of all, no change, leave it as it is. I'm going to imagine that's not very satisfactory to most people. The next one would be to meet our level of service standards, and if that sounds a little Greek to you, I understand. So level of service is really a performance measure used in traffic that's based on average vehicle delay. So, and it's kind of like a grading scale. If you have a LOS A, there's really minimal delays, and it goes all the way down to LOS F, which means there are excessive delays, or really that the demand is near capacity. In UG, we do have adopted standards for level of service. We accept LOS F in our downtown and LOS E in the rest of the city, on the city streets. I would say that the vast majority of the streets don't get anywhere near that.
Did you say D or B?
So E, as in elephant,
E, okay.
E in the vast majority of
Okay.
the city, and then downtown would be F. And and again, the other thing about level of service is it really only addresses vehicles at this point. I will say, as part of our long-range transportation plan, that actually the Planning Commission directed that the city and the council agreed that we expand the current level of service and TIA to look beyond vehicles. So the next possible concept would be to use crash data to address any safety issues. So we do hear and realize that safety is a pretty big issue. So we could use the crash data that we have. It's not always the most current, and it depends if the crashes get reported, but we do have it for some pretty major intersections. And then the concept here would be that folks could pick from a menu. So it would be clear and objective. You could pick from a menu and to reduce any crash reductions. Or it would be, it'd be a menu of crash reduction measures. The other option, which would really work better for multifamily than it would for single family, would be to increase the use of what we call transportation demand management plans. You may have heard of TDMs, you may not have. And really what they do is reduce overall vehicle trips from a development. They're intended to reduce demand on the transportation system and reliance on cars, and really encourage more walking, biking, transit, and ride sharing. Examples include the city actually provides us all free bus passes so that to encourage us to ride the bus. Some places have education components. Some places provide, better biking accommodations. They provide showers so that you could bike to work and have a good, be able to do that. So those would work in some cases more for multifamily, if they could increase the use of folks not bringing their cars there. And obviously other options as well would be a combo of these, and I'm sure that you all have some other ideas as well. So are there any questions on this particular one?
I think Tom has one.
Tom?
So I believe the traffic or the accident data is supposed to be somewhat related to Vision Zero. Or is that, how do you use past accidents to predict the future causality of addition GDG?
Scott, do you have a response for that particular one?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, and
Wait, do we have that microphone working?
can you just speak up, Scott? when you talk?
Scott can hear the question, so.
So basically, with Vision Zero in mind, how do we use past accidents to predict the outcome of a future expansion of our PVD? I'm not sure what the drop-down menu was going to look like.
With Vision Zero in mind, the idea of Vision Zero is that we have no fatalities.
Can you talk, like, stand up and just really talk? Sorry.
Thank you, Scott.
Oh, yeah, we're-
Like,
yeah, the whole purpose of Vision Zero is to have a transportation system with no fatalities on it or severe injuries. That's the bottom line of it. If we have crash data that shows there's repeated patterns at intersections, treatments can be applied to those intersections to mitigate those safety issues. So Vision Zero, I wouldn't say has it supports it, but it doesn't have a direct correlation between how we mitigate intersections.
But in clear and objective, how are we using past data to help a new PUD have to mitigate, I'm thinking the legal,
Yeah.
when it hits the legal side, they're gonna say, well, how does this influence my new development? Your past data.
Yeah.
You already need to fix that. Why is it my fault for adding more to it?
Yeah, past data, when we use crash data, it shows us what the problem is. So if there's repeated patterns, if we're having crashes between bikes and cars, we have just car to car, if there's different kinds of crashes out there, it tells us just exactly what we need to fix. So a suite of options, we have a tremendous amount of different options for treating vehicle issues, and a suite of options for treating multimodal and enhancing bicycle pedestrian. So what the theory would be is that if we had a specific type of crash, if we need to protect pedestrians, then we would select a suite of tools that would protect pedestrians.
Yeah, but I'm just
and
thinking.
so, Tom, jot that down as your
Okay.
concern. I think it's a valid, I hear your concern, and please write it down, because I hear it. I think, Ted, did you have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kelly.
I was just gonna add to Scott's comment. I'm a transportation engineer, I'm a consulting engineer. There are tools that have been developed that will predict crash rate frequency based on historic and increase in traffic patterns. They're not perfect, but they're, that's something that can be looked into is the possibility of using those tools that exist through the Highway Safety Manual of being able to be a predictor of an increase in frequency.
Kelly, would the idea there be to use that predictor to then generate pre-mitigating design solutions? That could, to your point, if we're trying to sort of get in front of the challenge and you could predict a certain outcome based on a change in traffic, that you would then be more inclined to have these crosswalks marked in this way, or this stop sign always exists, or this be the maximum speed limit in that area. I mean, is that the purpose of that information?
That is the purpose of that information. It's not a perfect calculation. I've used it before where it has some flaws to it, but it's something that could be used as a threshold. Because I've seen that to say, because that's part of the clear and objective is create a threshold for when you trigger the need for improvement. And ODOT uses it as a threshold for.
That's the main thing I'm actually trying to get to is the clear and objective aspect.
Right.
Because,
So
I
I know we
understand flow
just-
models, it's just.
I know.
Yeah.
Other clarifying questions, and then we've got a full, we're gonna have a full 15 minutes for table discussions. But clarifying questions on, Renee,
So it's kind of a two-part question.
and just really try to speak up.
I guess part A of the question would be, is it accurate that under a discretionary track, a TIA would be a separate sub-application? And B, if that is accurate, why could a clear and objective not also just cross-reference to that same sub-application?
It is interesting because the TIA can be triggered independently. It can be, if you came in with a building permit for, a 200-unit apartment complex, you could trigger a TIA. If you're also having to do a PUD for something of the same variety, there's actually a criteria that says you need to be consistent with the traffic impact analysis criteria. So under clear and objective, we could very well add a new criteria that says, hey, you need to meet the TIA criteria, but then we'd have to add clear and objective TIA criteria. And it is a good point. I mean, this is not an easy one, that, there's not, not easy ways to solve this particular one, to make it clear and objective.
Yeah.
But it could also be, it could just be embedded too, rather than being a separate application type, it could just be standards embedded within a PUD.
Ted and then Steve?
I just wanted a clarification because I don't want to assume anything. When you say on C, which is a menu of crash reduction measures, and so I'm assuming that those are, that menu has things that are projected to reduce crashes by a certain amount. And so is that something that'll be like scored? It's like, you need to come up with like a 5 on this menu, so which ones do you pick on the menu?
Honestly,
or-
we haven't gotten that far along,
Okay.
so, right. We don't want to do too much work down that path if nobody.
I just know how that works.
Yeah, no, I
And
think.
generally speaking, broadly, when you have a menu of options, that there needs to be something that's just not like, oh, I'm gonna take the cheapest one.
Right.
As opposed to, they all have to be effective according to our scoring, and therefore
Right.
it has to successfully add up to a number that mitigates the problem that triggered it in the first place.
It may be that, I'm not
Okay.
sure. Yeah, we haven't got there yet.
Steve?
Those are good points.
Yes.
Yeah, the way this is worded, it says a TIA is required. It doesn't say you have to do anything in response to it, so I don't know how it's not
Correct. I
clear.
mean-
If it's clear and objective that if you're over a certain size, you'd have to have the traffic engineer put together this report. But I don't see how it's not clear and objective.
When you look at, when you have the transfer, right, that the criteria that says do one is clear and objective. When you
Right.
get to the TIA criteria themselves, they are not clear and objective.
Yeah, but it just doesn't say you have to meet the criteria, it just says to say you have to submit a TIA.
But once you get to the TIA, well, like it's kind of a loophole, I would say. I mean, the intent is that that if you have a development, we want them to address traffic, not just submit something that we're not going to do anything with, or that, I don't think we want people making useless exercise out of this. I mean, I think it needs to be meaningful, or it's not worth having.
Yeah.
So.
Good point, though.
Yeah.
And just at this point, we're high level. At the point that there's actually code being written, that kind of thing would be like definitely.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the
really flagging
devil
that.
is going to be in the details on some of these for sure, and you're flagging things that our minds have been spinning around as well, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, good point.
And just to follow up to that, if the TIA is required, how would you get this, how would you get information like, in other words, would we require some other?
We could require a traffic study, we could, it would just, whatever criteria we would add, we
So
would
you'd have to
ask
have a
them.
specific criteria, traffic study that would show the increase in.
Exactly, yeah,
And
it doesn't,
numbers.
we don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a TIA, it can be a traffic study that does X, Y, and Z, it can be many things, we're not stuck with the current structure.
Right, I'm a little concerned because there's probably some familiarity with doing the TIA.
Right.
And so the criteria is standardized what you have to submit. If we try to create something from scratch, maybe more of a challenge than just using the TIA and then set some reasonable criteria that have to be met.
So I'm going to keep you
Should we keep moving?
moving because
Okay.
I really want time to discuss.
I know, I think you guys are going to have some good conversations on this one at your
And
tables.
Alyssa is going to be roaming at the table, so if you have specific questions for her at the end, she will come over and answer.
Okay, so the last one is about modifications, the access for people, for pets, for bikes, and emergency response as well. And then they're pretty specific standards for street connectivity. And then the other street standard that's referenced in this one is cul-de-sacs and emergency vehicle turnarounds, which once again has a pretty specific standard about how long those need to be, or the maximum for them. There are exceptions to all of these standards when there are physical conditions that basically preclude them from happening. So, for instance, if there's a creek or steep slopes or an existing house in the way, you may not have to extend the street, or maybe your block length gets to be a little bit longer or a little bit shorter in those cases. And this was brought, I'm not 100% sure. I'll be honest, not all of these did we completely understand the problem on this one, but I think in this particular case, there was a want to kind of booster or bolster that preclude information. So be really specific about what would preclude you from getting a modification to our street standards. Because, yeah, not every part of town looks like this. This is, much more common in our sloped areas where you have, you've got streets and cul-de-sacs and loop streets. And again, there were probably, some of these streets did get exceptions based on topography so that the blocks are a little bit longer. Some of the streets don't go through. So let me show you in this particular case. So again, possible concepts. So the first one would be no change, leave it like it is. The second one would be to really more specifically define those circumstances that qualify for an exception. The other option would be to, or you could combine these two as well, is to, instead of have exceptions, say, okay, you have to meet the block length of 600, end of story. You could request an adjustment review, which is actually a discretionary application that would go concurrent with your subdivision, for instance. And then maybe you all have some other ideas for this one as well. Any questions related to this particular one?
Actually, two short ones. One, street standards apply to alleys, or would that be considered under something that's completely different?
The block links and whatnot, alleys they are covered somewhat under the street standards in terms of width and design.
But what about through? Like, in terms of trying to facilitate through traffic, because they're not maintained. I just didn't know if there were
I have to say, we don't see very many
rules
new
for it.
alleys these days, so I don't know if the street connectivity standards actually just applies to streets, not to alleys.
Okay.
So.
And the other question was, how can you have an adjustment? I mean, wouldn't that kick it into
So that is interesting. The way our code is set up now is that you can choose to meet the standard, or you have the option of doing an adjustment review, your choice to do that discretionary application as well.
Yeah, so since we're doing clear and objective, does that mean that this wouldn't be part of clear and objective, would it?
So clear and objective, all clear and objective land use applications are eligible to apply for an adjustment review, but it kicks them into a discretionary review process with discretionary criteria for that particular one. So if you're an applicant, that may not be very appealing to you. But it acknowledges that, the lots, the properties that are left, that they're one size fits all doesn't really work. And we're trying to make it work. So here's a relief valve. So it's just one option as a relief valve.
And then, Steve, did you have a quick
Well,
question?
no, I was just questioning whether adjustment review is already allowed for the discretionary valve.
It is allowed for, I can't remember if it's allowed under, most of these have an exception clause that under certain circumstances, you just get an exception to it. I don't think they have an adjustment review.
Street connectivity is not adjustable.
Okay,
currently.
so they're not adjustable, there's just exceptions that you get as part of the development, and that those are the topographic considerations or existing development.
And that's part of the discretionary review.
It's also part of the clear and objective at this point.
But I still didn't quite understand on the traffic.
Former restaurant.
We're going to get started. We're going to shift to a little bit of geology.
Okay. Sorry, that was great discussions. And remember, you don't have to leave your papers tonight, so if your brain is spinning from your table discussions and you have ideas and stuff, feel free to keep your papers. Again, either fill them out, mail them, send them, scan them, send them to me however you want, or enter them into the online survey. So now we're going to move on to geotech and slope issues. So the purpose of geological and geotechnical analysis is to ensure that development in areas with potentially unstable soil conditions are located, designed, and constructed safely. In simple terms, we don't want roads that are going to slump, and we don't want buildings that are going to slide downhill. And this map, I'm going to talk about this a little in a couple slides, but this is a copy from what's called LIDAR, and it's a mapping tool that we have available. So what we have now, or how it works now, is that the standards for geological review for the clear and objective track are one size fits all. We basically require professional certification that the proposed development will not be impacted by springs or seeps, depth of soil to bedrock, variations in soil types, or any combination of those. Or if they are, the professional explains how to mitigate these impacts. So in contrast, the review standards for discretionary projects include a three-tiered level of review with increasing complexity based on the potential for the types of impacts. So this one is a much more detailed code section, and so on your tables, along with your packets, there's another salmon-colored sheet that is just the code excerpt for both the discretionary and at the bottom there's the little needed housing one, which is the clear and objective part. So I wanted to make sure you had that with you because for this discussion that one might be more helpful. So. Flipping papers here. So what are some concepts or ideas for addressing this one? The first is, of course, the do nothing, so no change. But there may be areas that can be exempted from the requirement based on geological formation, geographic location, or elevation. So we could maybe find some efficiencies. So one option is to establish, what would require or allow an exemption, and then for those that don't get the exemption, establish a clear and objective multi-level review with increasing complexity depending on the potential for impact. So more similarly mirrored to the discretionary approach, but with clear and objective standards. So another possibility would be to revise the current requirements to further address the site's geological formations, soil types, the presence of open drainage ways, and the existence of undocumented fill. Those were some of the other potential site conditions that we've heard about that we don't currently necessarily wrap into that requirement. So this could also require using that LIDAR map that I talked about or showed you before. And then also there's a statewide landslide information database of Oregon, SLIDO. So we could actually call to those two mapping tools in part of our requirements for clear and objective. Those are that are available and out there, readily available. So, or maybe we can think of other options with the table groups. The thing to keep in mind when you're discussing the geological and geotechnical requirement is that at the time of land division, the geotechnical evaluation is focused on suitability for future development. So it's too early in the process often to be structure specific, but it can inform lot configuration and identify lots that maybe shouldn't be built on, or lots that should have structure-specific engineering or geotechnical requirements later. And then further geotechnical analysis or requirements can be addressed at the time of the building permit when specific structures are proposed. So just to keep that in mind. Questions on this one quick before we move on to the next one? This here is the SLIDO map too, by the way. I wanted to make sure you saw what the LIDAR and the SLIDO look like.
Can you just say what the yellow is that elevation or is that?
Those are landslide risks. So, boy, I can't read that. it's landslide hazard. So the gray is no risk, then the yellow is kind of, medium, and then the orange is higher, and then the red is highest. So it's a tiered level. Those probably match some peaks in our South Hills.
Janessa,
Mhm.
when would this requirement be in play? Always?
The geotechnical requirement right now, there's no exemption, so
Okay.
every development has to address it.
Okay.
That's partly why on that one possibility would be to try to, if we're looking at efficiency measures, and it might be possible to at least alleviate that on some easy ones that really don't require it. Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on to slopes. So, go ahead, Steve.
So that map you showed in Slido?
Yeah. Do you want to go back?
Yeah, so is that a standard adopted by the state agency? In other words, is it stable that it wouldn't change from year to year to year? I mean,
I believe it's based on historic information. Scott, do you know the answer to that? You don't know? Ed?
Yeah, could that be overlaid with the buildable land inventory map?
The Slido or the LiDAR can. I don't know if we have a layer in our GIS for Slido, because you can go to the state site to pull up, and you can type in an address and check it there, but I'm not aware of us having access to a layer. Do you know, Scott?
If we could get access to the state's layer, yes, it could be overlaid.
So theoretically, yes.
Could you read the different categories that it's choosing about?
I was trying to. I don't. Do you have your reading glasses?
Oh my God.
I know the second word up there is hazard. I believe it says landslide hazard. And then there's low, moderate, high, and very high are the colors.
Yep. This is
Gotta love 40.
landslide unlikely, landslide possible, landslide likely, an existing landslide, it's very high.
Would this be like earthquake?
This is really going to be more just landslide, not taking into consideration an earthquake situation yet. I mean, those would be areas that I would assume are more likely to be affected by an earthquake. Okay, are we good to go on?
Yeah, go on.
Okay. So, the 20% prohibition on grading. This applies to clear and objective subdivisions and planned unit developments. So one of the issues, or how it was brought up, is that this may not be the most effective and efficient way to address potential impacts to steep slopes. And it may preclude development under the clear and objective track for sites with significant slopes, particularly for properties in the South Hills, or sites with unusual configurations where there could be an area or a swath of 20% slope that basically you can't, since you can't cross it, you would potentially have a portion of the site that you don't have access to developing that otherwise would be developable, but because of that configuration, it can preclude them using the clear and objective path. They can go to the discretionary, but again, if we're wanting to kind of look at our efficiency of the process, that's a consideration. So a couple words on buildable slopes. Again, I mentioned the discretionary track does not prohibit grading on any percentage of slope, so there's not a strict prohibition at any point. Instead, there's a criterion that requires that the development will not result in unreasonable risk, hear the discretion in there, of fire, flood, geological hazards, or other public health and safety concerns. So there's kind of that general criterion that's highly discretionary. And then outside of that, slope impacts are reviewed through the geotechnical analysis for discretionary traffic. So moving on, another sticking point on this that we've heard is that the mismatch with the buildable land requirements. So, for example, the state standards presume that slopes up to 25% are buildable for the purpose of doing a buildable lands inventory. Eugene's buildable land inventory that we have actually classifies lands up to 30% slope as potentially developable. So that was another thing that came up. So can you hold it real quick? And on your worksheet, you'll see a few possible concepts listed. Of course, the ever-present no change. One idea would be to increase the percentage limit either to 25% or 30% to be consistent with state or our own buildable lands target. Could retain the 20% and exempt certain grading activities and then codify how the slope is measured. That's another item that as a side issue could be clarified. We could eliminate the prohibition and rely on the geotechnical review requirements similar to the discretionary track. And that this is an area where, since we're looking at the geotechnical review requirements and this issue, maybe you make a note on your geotechnical that you want to specifically look at the impacts to roads and grading over 20% slopes. They kind of fit together a little bit. Then the other option would be to replace with a new requirement that really addresses soil erosion and slope failure. So those are kind of the ones the starter ideas that we came up with, or what you guys come up with. So certainly these aren't the only options, and this is one that could have a lot. Alyssa's back there got some maps that we had printed out. These show the buildable lands inventory and slopes around Eugene that are color-coded from 20% to 30% slope. So you're looking for the kind of pinks and dark purples, dark purple being the steepest slopes. And it's kind of hard to see sometimes, but you can look for the yellow areas to look for the vacant or partially vacant lands. The yellow means vacant, and the ones that have kind of a yellow or orange outline are partially vacant, so they could develop further. Okay, so quick questions before we totally break into table groups. Yeah, Ken?
Why 25 or 30%? I mean, as opposed to just looking at, what's the condition of the slope, what's the soil erosion, whatever. Why did somebody pick 25 or 30%?
The 25 and 30 just came from the fact that the state did the 25 or used 25, and our own study looked it up to 30%. So they're just numbers. They're still arbitrary in a sense.
So that, there's nothing like there's a significant increase in problems once you get past a certain degree percentage of the slope?
My understanding is that there's a lot that can be designed for. So there's not really, if you're an engineer, there's not really a slope that can't be built on. It's at what point does it get so expensive that it, precludes it. But it's a matter of engineering. Does that answer your question?
The idea that the flood rate goes up and their objective on it. Or they just figure out
the 20%, the 20%, thank you for saying, the 20% is a somewhat arbitrary number. Reading the South Hill study and like I can see little breadcrumbs of where if somebody was really trying to just grab a number to fix on, to have a clear and objective, I can guess where it came from, but we're not stuck with it. It's not. Okay, let's go ahead. Looks like everybody else started.
Yeah, how do you mean?
Somebody else somewhere else can buy the buildable land.
Right. Right.
I mean, human beings are building on cliff faces for.
Okay.
To some degree, not only are there's prohibition of
On the slopes?
Why did I wonder why we would.
But there's no viability design in that code. There's a PUD, there's nothing, they can't build a house on it, but they cut all the trees and started sliding down the hill into our other neighborhoods. And no one addressed that, they just basically did it, or built and slid. You can't take away the vegetation. Expected them to still hold the hillside.
Well, my understanding, I don't know how the 25% can be stayed. I agree with this. So our final topic tonight, we only have one issue, but it's a big one. It's compatibility. So compatibility is a highly discretionary term. This probably is why it currently is left out of the clear and objective tracks for conditional use, site review, and planned unit developments. Whereas discretionary tracks have requirements that proposals be reasonably compatible with regard to building mass and scale and adequate screening and setbacks. We don't have anything like that comparable in the clear and objective track. So for these application types, that is the new that the new compatibility criterion would apply to. We're typically talking about multifamily, assisted living, or maybe like a PUD that, or planned unit development, sorry, that would create a higher intensity use next to a lower intensity use. So we're talking like multifamily next to single family residential, or clustered development in a planned unit development that's if it's close to a single-family residential area. So there are some clear and objective tools that we could use to implement that would address some compatibility impacts. So this graphic kind of shows us what we want to avoid, right? We've got a single-family house, and then you've got your building that comes in that's massive and bulky, and there's a big loss of privacy and potentially sunlight. So, so what tools can we use to prevent this? So, transition buffers can be used, and transition buffers can address some of these impacts by using distance. So, for instance, increased setback requirements. They can use height limitations, so sloped setbacks or step backs. So, maybe for the first 15 feet you're limited in building height, and then for the next 15 feet you go up, and so you transition to the higher height limitation of the higher zone. And then landscape requirements can certainly help to minimize scale contrasts and protect privacy and provide screening.
Biophilic design.
Then other options could also require having upper level balconies or terraces be set back farther from the property line than a normal setback. So taking that impact further back to help protect some privacy. And for solar access, that was an issue that we heard through the focus group sessions too. And this could be addressed by implementing a solar setback that would limit the amount that a new building could shade properties to the north. So on your sheets, you've got the concepts that we have started, and no change. You could develop transition buffers that are implemented. This is kind of like when we talked at our last session about the conditional use and site review and plan unit development processes. One of the things that came up, I think, at all of our tables was the concern that, that these really should be addressing when there's a higher impact development next to a low impact or low intensity development. So this first concept would be to develop transition buffers specifically when when a higher intensity use is proposed near a lower intensity use. So multifamily next to single family. Another idea would be to develop a minimum transition buffer around the perimeter regardless of the size or use. So, currently in most of our residential zones, it's a 5-foot setback, although there are some existing, I think it's a 50-foot height limitation within when R3 and R4 are next to an R1, so a low density. But this could be in addition to that, where you would require just a set one, and 10 foot is just an arbitrary number. The idea is that it's a minimum or just a fixed number. Or you could develop a scalable transition buffer that would be proportional to the size of the proposed development. So the bigger the development, the bigger the buffer required.
Would that have to be spelled out eventually?
Right, and you could spell that out, and anything's possible. So, I mean, this is where we really want to get your ideas on what helps mitigate the impacts that you're most concerned about.
And can I ask you one more thing?
Mm-hmm.
The difference between B and D is that D is, you change, well, I don't know, one would be fixed and the other would be movable, or flexible or something?
Between B and D or C and D?
B and D.
So B is kind of more of your, I envision B as being a more prescriptive approach that would be more specific, would maybe not apply in as many, there would be exceptions to it if you're not next to a lower intensity use. So if you're an R2 development next to another R2 development, then you may not need to do that. But if you're R2 or R3, which are medium and higher densities, and next to an R1 development that's a low density, then it would be applied. So you're really looking at the cases where that contrast in development is highest.
Yeah, I get B, but I guess I don't really get D as much.
So D would be just, it could be, for small sites you have a 10-foot buffer, but then, for say under an acre, and I'm just throwing this out here, and then, you could set another threshold limit where you would require a 15-foot setback, as a buffer, it would be a scalable requirement, and probably primarily distance. But there's other, this is just to.
You gave us example of D, but I'm just kind of, it'd be nice if there was a picture of what you need for D. But, okay.
I mean, one thing in the
okay,
groups,
all right.
Pam, I think that's a good thought. In the groups, when we do our thinking, maybe we can each think of some examples of what scalable would be, and then just share that at the end, because that's a good question, and I don't know, Pam, that we've thought creatively about all the possible ways that you could scale it yet.
That's what I was going to say, is that this is a complicated issue, and there's a lot of possibilities, and it's finding that balance between, mitigating impacts, but not being too, difficult to develop. Yeah, Kristen?
One interesting code section you can take a look at on the mixed-use station.
Oh, wait, we can't hear you.
Walnut Mixed-Use Station uses form-based code. It's the only section in Eugene's code that does form-based, and one of the things that the code is doing in that particular section is trying to do this kind of scalable. So you can take a look at that just for your additional homework reading afterwards.
Sorry, what was that again?
Walnut Mixed-Use Station. And it's an overlay. Special area zone. So chapter 9.
Thank you.
And we've got one other question.
Oh, Ted?
Yeah, I just think of an example, and if I'm right, we discussed this during our focus group, was the idea that you have a subdivision or whatever, and because you've got a scalable transition buffers, it'd be like, okay, this many houses, so you need 30-foot buffers around it, but that might not necessarily be what you would want, because it would eliminate the smooth transition between two different neighborhoods. And so that would be maybe a disadvantage to it, instead of looking at it exactly what it is on the ground in terms of the compatibility in that way. It's just sets a number that has to be like, you have 150 houses, you need a 30-foot buffer. When then you get those developments that have like a wall all the way around, and then like a kill zone or whatever on the other side of that wall for zombies or something.
Right, that's a good point, because that's, again, you know, the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't necessarily allow you to create kind of a smoother transition either. So, especially, I think if I'm remembering right, you're recalling some of our discussion around the planned unit development 30-foot buffer requirement, which we'll be talking about next week, specifically, because that is an example where we have a straight 30-foot buffer period, and that's problematic. And so, you know, that's something that would be great for people who have experience, especially design professionals at the table and stuff. If you've worked through projects like this, or, you know, if you have some input on you know, what that impact is when you're designing something into the amount of space and getting everything to fit, versus if there's other options that help to address the same ideas that aren't just throwing a number at a distance. And I think that's often the easy button, you know, is to just go, okay, we'll just set it back far enough. But that may not make the best livable space.
That would probably drive you towards less compatibility in the long run.
To follow on what you just said, that when we're talking about urban lands and the desire to develop them, when whole portions of those lands are unable to be developed, it puts greater intensity on the remaining square feet within that parcel to be developed to the maximum envelope. So when we're talking about things like graceful transitions and gradients, it's the elimination of some of those blanket setback distances, like a 30-foot setback from a property line, can be really influential with other form-based code considerations to getting much better outcomes.
So don't give that up. There's one more code section you can look up, is the Chapter 9. Karen reminded me. So the eWeb Riverfront, that special area zone, also kind of the second try at form-based code. So it's got some great graphics. It's got better graphics than the Walnut mixed-use station.
Okay, well, that's all I had, and we had already jumped into the questions. So again, complicated issue, and hopefully we can get some really good discussion and lots of notes on this one, because this is going to be a difficult one to kind of quantify and get into a clear and objective form, but I think it's important that we try. Okay, go ahead.
So I guess I don't understand. We're talking about the what's the difference between that?
No, I got it.
Well,
Thank you.
I think part of the question is whether or not that 30-foot buffer requirement for municipalities is really intending to address compatibility, or is it a disincentive for the user because currently
Right, there needs to be setbacks.
Which code is that?
Yeah.
Are you meaning